Well, good morning, Hope Community Church. Hey, my name is Davis, and I'm one of the pastors here at our downtown location. And I'm excited to welcome you to our online worship service. And this morning, I want to kick things off with an exciting announcement. We are welcoming Calvin Shaw Lewis into the world, baby Cal, to parents Sarah Lewis and Jeff Lewis as well. Sarah's on staff here at the downtown location, working with our Women of Hope as well as our partner ministries. And if you want to help just bless this family as they move from a family of 2 to 3, would encourage you to sign up for their meal train. And if you're wondering, why is that baby wearing glasses? And why are they so big? Well, it's because this baby, based on his initials, has become affectionately known, at least on our staff team, as C.S. Lewis. And so that's what we're seeing in this little baby, this new C.S. Lewis, which is good for us. So if you've thought about maybe moving on from Hope and checking out some other churches as you have a job that's taking you out of town, just want to encourage you to come back in about 18 years when this baby graduates from Oxford and is writing some amazing apologetics for the glory of God. So welcome, baby C.S. Lewis, and congratulations to Sarah and Jeff. We are so excited for you guys. If you are just joining us, maybe for the first time in a while, we are actually in the middle of a summer sermon series that we have called The Story of the Bible in 16 Verses. And this is based on a book by Chris Bruno. Actually used to be local around here. Now he lives in Hawaii. Sounds pretty nice. And basically, he just wants to help capture the story of the Bible by just looking from a 30,000-foot level. What is the message that God is telling through this ancient text? And just to catch you up to speed, we've seen how God has actually created all things by the word of his mouth. He just spoke everything into existence. That was week 1. Then we saw how mankind, who God created in his image, created a God-sized problem. Not God, man. Man created a God-sized problem by bringing God into the world. And then God is going to zero in on one family who we've now been seeing grow. Starting with Abraham, God sets promises and makes a covenant with Abraham unconditionally, saying, I'm going to establish you. I'm going to position you and your family into the promised land, and you're going to multiply, and the world is going to be blessed through this family. And I'm always encouraged whenever I see that story, because if your family is a mess, then I encourage you to read the Bible, because you're going to see there's messes everywhere when it comes to families in the Bible. And if your family is not a mess, I'm going to encourage you to also read the Bible and see that, no, your family actually is a mess. Every family is a mess. And then last week, just to get us fully up to speed here, Bart Carey, one of our elders here, led us through the initial story of Exodus and the Passover. So we heard about how Israel was actually enslaved. God's people, this one family, had multiplied out to a nation, but they were enslaved by the Egyptians. And God sent Moses in to set Israel free and release them from this bondage and actually take them into the promised land. He separates the Red Sea, and Moses leads this large group of people onto the promised land. And I think as a reader of the Bible, you're left wondering, is this it? Did they actually get out from all their problems? Is the sin problem taken care of? Is it time to sip pina coladas and enjoy the sunsets in the promised land? But the story takes a surprising left turn, and God gives Moses the law in this dark, stormy section of the story, and we're left wondering, what is this law, and what does God have in mind in giving it? So that's what we're looking at today, the law, and why God is actually giving it. So we're actually halfway through the sermon series, and we're going to be looking at Exodus 19, 4 through 5, and the story and intention of God giving the law to Israel. Just a little bit of a flyover of where we're actually going to head this morning. I just want to look at 3 questions. What is the law? Why does God actually give the law? This is a question that the New Testament asks in the language of why then the law, which will hopefully make more sense once we get there. And then based on these things, how then are we to live? So starting with what is the law? The law simply can be summarized by the 10 Commandments given to Moses. And what that is a national covenant between God and Israel for this people group, Israel, to be set apart from all the other nations. Things like food laws, Sabbath keeping, even how to grow crops, how to stay healthy. There's some medical laws in there, how they are to treat foreigners and outsiders. At this time, This is a covenant made between God and his people about how they are to actually live, so that they might be distinct from other nations. You hear things like in Deuteronomy 4:8, and what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? So again, there's this distinction between Israel and the rest of the nations that surround it because they have clarity about what God expects of them. They're not left to their own devices to figure that out. And secondly, it's for individuals to actually understand the holiness of the God that they now know and worship. We hear things like in Psalm 119, I'm a stranger here on earth. Do not hide your commands from me. This is a prayer to God. My soul is consumed with longing for your laws at all times. So we first see that the law is this national covenant between God and Israel for them to be set apart, both as a community and as individuals as they pursue holiness. We also see in the Old Testament that this is a means for these people to obtain or maintain the promises first given to Abraham. So way back a couple weeks ago when Pastor Cora led us through Abraham, the start of this people group of Israel, God makes an unconditional promise to him and to his descendants saying, I'm going to establish you. It's not going to be the work of your own. It's going to be me. I'm going to bring you into the promised land, and you're going to be multiplied, and eventually it will be a blessing to all people. And so this law comes along, as we learn in Exodus 19, as a condition that's added later in the story. This is God speaking now to Israel right after he redeems them from the physical oppression of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. He says this, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt. Namely, I opened the waters and you walked through, and then I closed the waters on the Egyptians who were pursuing you to take you captive again. And how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And here it is. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. It's really important not to miss that. If you obey me fully, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Charles Hodge, who wrote a thick, dense, systematic theology book that's very hard to read at times, but has some really good stuff in it, clarifies what this Mosaic law is and how it contrasts from the promises given to Abraham. Hear his words. He says, contrary to the unconditional covenant given to Abraham, the Mosaic law was a national covenant between God and the people of Israel. The promise was national security and prosperity. The condition was the obedience of the people as a nation to the Mosaic law. In this aspect, it was a legal covenant saying, quote, do this and you will live. Do this and you will live. That's a quote actually from Leviticus 18:5. God says, do this and you will have life. But obviously the flip side of that is don't do this and you will have death. So if you're getting lost in some of the big, heady kind of religious language here, I want us to see that the Mosaic covenant is a conditional charter given to Israel, saying, if you do these things that I'm laying out in the Ten Commandments and beyond, then you will have life, security, prosperity. But if you don't, you're going to be kicked out. And it's a lot like the story of Encanto with Grandma Abuela, as Cor led us through a couple weeks ago. He used this illustration to describe what the gospel is not. He said that the imagery of this family receiving a miracle, and then the grandmother saying, based on our behavior, based on what we do now with this miracle, this is what will ensure us that we will continue to have blessing and more miracles for the family to enjoy and for the benefit of the community. Cor said, that's not like the gospel. That's so true. It was so helpful to see this. That is, however, like the Mosaic covenant. In fact, when you're watching this movie, I want you to just hear, Moses is Abuela and what God is laying out in this covenant. If you watch Encanto. I'm not saying you have to, though you should. It is a good movie. There's got a lot going on in there. So the big question, though, if this is true, if the Mosaic covenant is laying out conditions now for what Abraham was originally promised, namely to get into this land and to enjoy the prosperity that God once gave, how is that going to go? The answer, it takes the rest of the Old Testament to show us. Not well. In fact, those who receive these conditions, these laws, first say, okay, we can do it, amen. We're a little bit terrified right now. Please tell God to stop talking to us. But yes, we'll do the laws, we'll do the things. And then all of them eventually go astray, and none of them, except for two, make it actually into the promised land. Even Moses offends the laws of God and is punished and doesn't make it into the promised land. And later, once Israel, the descendants of Israel, the next generation comes along and goes into the promised land, they're going to get the boot and they're going to be exiled. This big word that hangs over so much of the Old Testament. And it is impossible to overstate the significance of exile in the big story of God. Exile is the time when the Babylonians come in and they actually rule over the Israelites. And the reason it's so significant is because it leaves you as the reader and those who are experiencing it wondering, where are the promises of God? Didn't he say this wouldn't happen, that he was going to be the one that was going to establish us? And throughout so much of the story and many of even the Psalms and so many of the things that we have written down in the poetic books of the Old Testament, there's this wondering, this longing of, God, where are you in the midst of this exile? Yes, we have offended your laws, but aren't your promises bigger than our offense? That's a big question, so much of the Old Testament. So with that in mind, I want us to now transition to what is God doing here? Why is the law given at all? Why then the law? This is a question that haunts a guy who wrote so much of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul. Here's him studying, wondering, questioning, God, why did you give the law? If you know anything about the Apostle Paul, you know this is a guy who had at one time in his life mastered the Old Testament law. Like when it comes to Moses, this guy was acquainted with all of his writings so well. He memorized a majority of them until he meets Jesus and he realizes so much of what I've been trying to do in my behavior and my learning of these laws has really been an attempt to actually run away from God, to hide from him and try and prove my own righteousness apart from God. And so after meeting Jesus, he's going, the law isn't the thing. The law is not the thing that brings us to God. So why did God give this law at all? And a lot of what he's going to be writing then in the New Testament is going to frame around this question. And I think he asks such good questions because of the way that he thinks. He just holds a sword in his office and studies. I just think my sermons would be better if I held a sword while I wrote them or thought through the text. Anyway, I digress. So he asks the question in Galatians 3. He says this, the law, which was given to Moses 430 years after the promise to Abraham, it doesn't set aside the covenant previously established by God and thus do away with the promise. So it doesn't do that. For if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise. But God in his grace gave it to Abraham through a promise. So why then was the law given at all? There's the question. Paul's laying out the history of the story of the Bible, and he's saying, so if it doesn't set aside the promise, no matter how much we disobey it and break the covenant that God gave to Moses, why would God give this thing at all? And I want us to look at 5 answers that the New Testament is going to clarify. Because again, we at Hope are trying to instill in ourselves a regular reading the Bible of left to right and then interpreting right to left. Going back through the story, and while you do that, I want you to think of it as like walking by the cross. You have to walk by the cross of Christ to understand the whole story. Every time you go to the Old Testament, you have to walk by the cross, interpret right to left. So 5 things. The first one is the first answer he actually gives right here in Galatians 3. It was added because of transgressions. In other words, the law is given to clearly define sin, which is a really difficult task to people who are deceived, like us, about the ways that sin actually operates in our world and operates in our lives. Jesus himself, in Mark 7, says this, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. And this is a mic drop moment at the time because they're arguing about religious practices of how they should clean their hands and obey the Mosaic law so that God continues to show them favor. And Jesus says, you're missing the whole point. Sin itself isn't just a behavior. It's a heart condition. It's something that rests beneath the surface. And so it's actually what comes out of you that is the problem. This is where transgressions operate. And it isn't just the bad things we think, the bad things we feel, the bad things we do. It actually even is the good things at times, like Paul himself realized. Ted Peters clarifies this really helpfully in his book called Sin Boldly. It's a great title. I'm pulling off the idea from Martin Luther. And he says this about the ways that we hide from God. He says, our daily inclination is to draw a line between good and evil and then to place ourselves on the good side of the line. We do this unconsciously when we follow the rules. We do this consciously when meeting someone new, when we try to look good for others. And what the gospel reveals in light of these things is very surprising. It's actually quite counterintuitive. He says, when we draw this line between good and evil and then place ourselves on the good side of the line, the gospel reports that God is on the evil side of the line. Really? Yes, truly. When we pursue what we deem to be the good, God sides with those who become victimized by our pursuit. He goes on. When we stomp on the accelerator of our own virtuous achievements, a poisonous gas comes out of our exhaust pipe that suffocates those we are leaving behind. What we are blind to is that our own pursuit of self-justification victimizes others, and our gracious God sides with the victims. To say it another way, our virtues are just as deadly as our vices, and God, among others, suffers from our virtues. Did you catch that? Ted is saying that in this constant quest that we have of dividing good and evil, and unconsciously at a lot of the time, and even sometimes consciously going, oh, I'm actually on the good side of the team in most things. We are making a mess all around us, and God himself says, every time you draw that line, I actually side with those who you are maybe unconsciously against, those who you say are evil. Those are who I died for. And even more than this, it doesn't just take us harming others for God to side with them. It actually is the ways that we pursue virtue, pursue goodness, as a means of hiding from God. To declare independence from him, ultimately saying, I actually don't even need God. I think I can do this on my own. So the law is the thing that comes in to ultimately reveal these habits to us, because it's so hard to show a hiding heart the ways that it hides. But God is a master teacher, and one of the ways that he's teaching us is by giving us this law. Romans makes this clear about what the law is doing and how it operates in our life. In Romans 3, it says this, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. That's right. Let me read that again. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. Through the law, we become aware of our sin. God comes in and he actually uncovers the heart. You might even say he pokes our heart. If you've ever seen that classic video of the kids arguing about whether it's raining or sprinkling. It's actually a really great picture of the way sin operates in all of us, and the way that we double down and stand for what we think is right, even though we make a fool of ourselves. We need God to come and poke our hearts. And the law is, one of the reasons God gives the law is to do this, is to clearly define this is what sin is. The second reason, and this is one that might make your mind blow a little bit because it does to me, is that the law comes to increase sin. That's right. Romans 5 says, the law was brought in so that the trespass might increase. This is one of those ideas that requires New Testament revelation to go back and see that this is what God was doing all along in the story of the Old Testament. The reason he's giving the law is to first clarify sin, to show us like a mirror, a cosmic mirror, the insides that we can't see with our own eyes. We need spiritual eyes to see our spiritual state. And God gives us a law to show us that. But secondarily, he gives the law to actually increase the transgression, to turn up the volume on how sinful sin really is and how much it's making a mess of us and our lives and the story of humanity. So certainly in the storyline of God, you see this all over the place. In fact, when God first gives the Ten Commandments to Moses in Exodus 32 through 34, what happens? While that's taking place, while God is etching in stone with his finger, this is my command to you, down on the foot of the mountain, the Israelites who had just been miraculously delivered by God are throwing the first frat party mankind has ever known, and they're worshiping themselves. They take all the gold and they melt it down and they form it in this golden calf and they bow down to it and say, ultimately, we delivered ourselves. Because they're not worshiping the cow, right? They're worshiping their ability to form the cow out of the gold and say, ultimately, it was us by walking through the Red Sea that God had parted. But disregard that. We were the ones who walked through. Aren't we so special? And even just seeing that, while the command is coming in, the sin is just mind-numbing, almost comical. I think it is in one sense meant to be humorous when we read this, of like, are you kidding me? This God just delivered you and you're so quickly turning away from him as the law is being inscribed. And throughout the rest of the story, you see again and again, the moment command comes in, sin just runs wild and the transgressions multiply like a wildfire. Jonah is a great example of that. You don't have the story of Jonah unless you have the command of God telling Jonah to go and preach to the Ninevites. And then sin just runs wild in his life. We see this also in real life. Steve Kerr, the winning, one of the most winningest coaches in the NBA right now, who used to play with Michael Jordan, now he coaches. I caught an interview with him recently talking about the referees. And man, if there is a time in human history where we don't trust referees, it is right now. In any sport, we have centers that are located central in the U.S. where you have other referees watching referees real time, reporting on events that are taking place. And the transgressions of the individuals who are playing or coaching or watching, that's a confession, multiply in the midst of these events. And Steve himself, who's known to be one of the most civic, kind coaches in the league, said this recently in an interview. He says, I would never say the things that I do to referees to a person in normal life. And he goes on to describe, like, it happens two to three times a year where I just lose it. My daughter texts me like, Dad, what are you doing? I can see you mouth the things that you're doing on the screen, and then Twitter's blowing up about it. And then Steve just says, and I'm so embarrassed. I don't even know what takes over, and I don't know why it happens. Well, we might say, from a theological standpoint, the referee, the one who's standing in as the law of that game, is multiplying the transgression. Or if you're a fan of Calvin and Hobbes, I forget the guy's name who actually was the author of these comic books, but this guy was a master in understanding human nature. And so here's Calvin running through the house, and his parents say, Calvin, stop running. And then Calvin stops, and he looks at us, and he says, the law is on the books, but it would take all their resources to follow through on enacting the law or to punishing me. And then he takes off again, multiplying, actually probably running faster, knowing, in fact, that he is doing wrong for certain. Now he wants to run even further. So the law actually increases transgression. It causes something to come alive in us that makes us want to commit the offense even more at times. Not always, but a lot of the time. 3, why then the law? It's to show how everyone is under the law. Now, if I had time, this is actually what I would do the entire sermon on. But for the sake of brevity, I want us to just first if you're curious about this one, turn to Romans 2 and just read that whole chapter. Paul's big argument is, Israel, you think you're so special because you have the law. Look around you. Everyone has the law. Everyone has a sense of good and evil. Even if it's distorted, they're trying to measure up to that sense of goodness so that they can attain some form of righteousness, some form of peace by what they do. Authors Will McDavid and David Zoll elaborate on this. They call it a little L law, which I love that name. And they say this, we can better understand our relationship to the law of God by examining our relationship with little L law, because the psychological impact of them is often the same. The little L law, thou shalt be beautiful, or thou shalt be successful, is often more measurable in our real day-to-day lives than the law of God, as well as more salient in people's lives. That is, the pressure to be well-liked or valued at work is often stronger than the pressure to be a perfect person. And while holiness is usually invisible, things like salary, number of social media followers, and body weight can be easily measured. We could add to that list any variety of things. All of these things add up to become the surface pressure that we all live under, like that great song from Encanto, sung by Big Sister Louisa, Surface Pressure. If you haven't heard it, I truly could not write a more theologically accurate song to the way the little L law works in people's lives, all of our lives, than what Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote in this song, Surface Pressure. She's just talking about, I'm the strong one, I'm not nervous, I'm supposed to be perfect all the time, but beneath the surface, that's where I'm just losing my mind. I'm walking a tightrope. The pressure is always mounting up, and I'm wondering, is there any form of relief, or am I forever to walk this tightrope with expectations and performance as my MO for the rest of my days? And then there's this moment in the song where she says, but what if there were no more expectations on me? Can you imagine? I would say to her, I'm a pastor, and boy, do I have some good news for you. But she's not real, so I can't tell her that. So the third one, the law is operative in everyone's life. Look around you. You yourself have little L laws that you are feeling today, that you are bringing into this room in front of this screen, that you are feeling right now, that ultimately are easier to measure than the capital L law of God. And God's intention is to show us this, that we are living under the burden of law because of sin, and we're trying to get out by what we do. Fourth, from a 30,000-foot level, what the Bible is doing, this one is maybe most significant. It's to reveal our need for a second Exodus. In other words, when God redeemed Israel physically from the right hand of Pharaoh and his oppression, he didn't fully redeem them from their biggest threat. Their biggest enemy was not taken care of by that mini form of salvation that was offered. They all died in the wilderness after that, right? And the whole reason God is doing this is to give us a blueprint, a map of sorts, of the greater exodus that every human being needs from a greater threat, a greater enemy than Pharaoh and the Egyptians. What do I mean? Well, think back to Israel being enslaved physically. This is ultimately a giant arrow pointing to the fact that you and I, as human beings, have been locked up under sin and ruled by the threat of death that's coming for all of us. 100% of us are all going to die. And that's a picture of a form of spiritual enslavement that we can't get out from under, that God wants us to see in this story. These physical realities representing greater spiritual realities in our lives. So when Israel is set free physically then, this is like a giant arrow pointing ahead to the need for humanity to ultimately be set free, for there to be a greater exodus. The first exodus in the Old Testament is laying the groundwork to say there needs to be a greater form of redemption, one that doesn't just expire on the other side of the Red Sea. And that ultimately is going to be connected to the gospel that we talk about week in, week out here at Hope. It's the fact that Jesus Christ, like Moses with uplifted arms, opening up the sea that separates Israel from the promised land, Jesus Christ would one day be lifted up, crucified on a cross to open up the chaotic waters of sin that leads to death, that ultimately separate us from the ultimate promised land, namely life with God forever in eternity. Week in, week out, we talk about this gospel, this good news, this second Exodus, because this is what God has been interested in telling all along, and it's the reason he gives the law, is to show that Israel is not yet redeemed. The reason he puts them under law is to show them this, to say, hey, you thought Pharaoh was your big enemy, the big threat to your life, but do not fear the individual who can only kill your body, but the one who can also kill your soul, namely sin that leads to death. And so if we are following along with the physical patterns representing greater spiritual realities, then is there a greater spiritual reality of Israel being under law? Now that the gospel has come, now that Christ has died and taken care of the sin problem for us by giving us his righteousness and taking our unrighteousness onto himself, is there a second law, a second Sinai that comes? And I'm here to say this morning, there is not a second law. This does not get repeated in the New Testament. The reason this is there in the Old is because redemption still needs to take place. Christ still needs to be crucified to take care of our sin problem. But in the New Testament, we learn the sin is not going to be your master anymore. Redemption is fully completed at the cross of Christ so that you are not going to be under law anymore, but under grace. So if there is a second pattern of being under something, it is not law. It is under grace. It is under the good news of Christ crucified in your place. Life, righteousness, prosperity, freely given at the great expense to God, standing in your place to endure the wrath set before him. This is why we talk about this week in, week out, that you are actually under grace for those who are in Christ. Because we're not in the business of behavior modification. We don't think it actually works. The law itself is pointing to the need for Christ and his gospel. And it's his grace that ultimately gives life. That's the form of healing that the Bible constantly is pointing to. The greater second Exodus is the announcement, the proclamation of this news that God came to earth and died in your place. And so we gather around this news not only weekly but daily, because this is where life is found. This is where the only form of healing can actually be realized. Grace is good news, and nothing else is. Everything else is if-then conditional statements. Grace is God's business of because, therefore, and the contrast could not be more stark. Which brings us to the fifth point of why then the law. It's to contrast this message, this gospel of grace. The law says, if then. Martin Luther famously says, the law says, do this, and it is never done. Grace says, believe in this, and everything is already done. Of course, we have to throw thug life glasses on him, because that is just an amazing statement. It is a life-changing statement. It is something that will come beneath you, underneath you every single day and bring relief to the surface pressure, the burden of living under law. The only thing that can cure our deepest anxieties is God's message of grace. His replacement of the if-then of the law with the because, therefore of the gospel. Because Jesus died, therefore we have his righteousness, and all that he died to do is now enacted onto our accounts. It's the sweetest deal in the universe. And that contrast between do this and it is finished, believe, could not be more stark. It's all over the New Testament. 2 Corinthians 3, Galatians 4. Galatians 3, this is the one I wanted us to look at. Not only for the beginning of justification, the beginning of salvation, which we call justification, but for all of life. Paul writes to the people who have added to this message of grace in Galatians 3. He says this, I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? Have you experienced so much in vain, if it really was in vain? So again, I ask, does God give you his Spirit and work miracles among you by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? These two things stand in stark contrast, which brings us to the final point. How then shall we live? Well, I think it's here for us. Do we live by works of the law? Now that we've heard this message of the gospel and come to believe, do we now turn back to the law? Move from law to gospel and then back to law? Or do we carry on by believing what we've heard? I think the answer is so crystal clear here in Galatians 3 by saying, don't go back to law. Go back to now believing what you heard and learning it anew in every category of your life. It's a lot like studying, I hope you can see this painting by Lucas Cranach. It's about 500 years old. And this artist, when he was actually hearing the teaching of Martin Luther, the guy who helped clarify the message of the gospel for us 500 years ago, reclaimed it from the ways that it had been hidden for thousands of years since Augustine and even the biblical writers before him. This artist sat under this teaching and began to position the gospel into his craft and actually gave us a beautiful picture of the different ways of living, either under law, the burdens of law on the left, or under the gospel there on the right. I suppose that would be, if you're looking at me, it'd be that and that. But anyway, on the left, you see, and he actually connects this to the two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that we might say is the law, which mankind has been under since Adam and Eve, and the tree of life, which we'd say is the cross. So on the left side, you have the life under the law, and you see the individual who's meant to be representative of all of us fleeing away as he's naked. He's exposed, and it's not meant to just be physical nakedness. It's meant to be spiritual, emotional. All that we are is laid bare before God because of the law, and it's terrifying. And the instructors there are, if you see really close in the middle there, they're actually pointing to the law, and they're saying this is what you need to be doing. And it's causing the individual to flee, and his enemies, who are depicted by some skeleton and like a demon thing, are prodding him. They're poking him, saying, you are deserving of the fire that you're running into. And you can see the temple behind him and Adam and Eve taking from the fruit, as well as the placement of Jesus here. He's far away, separated from the individual, way off in the clouds. That's what life is under the law. Burdened, fearful, anxious, wondering where is God. Night and day difference from the right side of what life looks like by believing what we heard. The individual is still naked, still exposed, but his instructor has a finger not towards the law, but actually pointing towards the cross, saying, study this, hear from this, believe this good news that the God-man literally did come to earth to die for you, to take care of your sin problem. He was born under this law, and he died under the law. But then he came back to life and is now freed. The law has no jurisdiction over him because he died. And you are united with him by your belief, by your trusting in his righteousness, not your own. The enemies are trampled beneath that lamb beneath the cross. And Jesus himself, my favorite part of the painting, is that Jesus is near. Right? He's coming towards the individual. He says, this is how I want you to know who I am as God, the one who came to earth to die for you. Life lived under this cross. This is how we ought to live. Jesus says as much in John 6 when he was asked, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus' response is so simple. The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent, to let this belief in the crucified and risen Jesus grow and flower into the rest of your life. I want to end where we began, which is by looking at C.S. Lewis, Charles Shaw Lewis. No. And he says this in his wonderful series, The Chronicles of Narnia. Aslan, this Jesus-like character, is reacquainted with one of the main characters, Lucy, as she's gotten older. And Lucy says, Aslan, you're bigger than the last time I saw you. And Aslan says, that is because you are older, little one. Not because you are, I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger. Friends, this is how we ought to live, that as we grow in this Christian life, Jesus himself becomes bigger. The enormity of all that he accomplished in our place on the cross becomes more sizable, more significant, more available to us in our daily troubles, more available to us in the midst of broken down vehicles and trouble with money and fights with family and friends. Jesus Christ and him crucified takes care of our burden and has something to say in the midst of every situation and circumstance. He doesn't get rid of it, but he helps us look with clear eyes at our very real situation and how he's going to overcome everything that separates us from him. So I want us to close with these two questions. Have you yourself become tired of your own self-righteousness and learned to breathe the fresh air of Christ's righteousness freely given for you? And if you have, are Jesus and his gospel growing and replacing the law in all areas of your life? Because it's meant to. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for the gospel, which speaks a better word to us than the law. The law is good, but it's powerless to enact all of the things that it's calling us to be. Only the grace of God can do that. And your grace, God, was most manifest to us in the gospel, the good news of Christ crucified. Bless us this week and help us to bring the gospel into every situation, every circumstance, every relationship we're in, and to feel the easy burden of what it means to be grafted into you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for joining us this week. Hope we'll be back here the same time next week. We'll see you then.